the theoretical trajectories that I started with were post-structural and sociocultural very much. During my master's, it was a master's program that was focused on plurilingualism, towards the end of it, Diane was already together with Kéline Tuhi, if some of you, I'm sure, most of you, I'm sure, will remember her. They were both diving into sociomaterial theories, so that was the kind of natural sort of continuity of the exploration that I was doing of the literature that was emerging and was taking space in language and literacy education at the time. Not very much in the beginning, it's grown since then, but my work with Diane especially has really allowed me to dive into the Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy, in which the rhizome that you see in the back of the picture here, if you haven't recognized it yet, is a central figure, and that's what I was also referring to with the title when I talked about entering in the middle. Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy, new materialism, and post-humanism were very much in taking more and more space in Diane's writing at the time, and she invited me kindly to work as her doctoral student and as a research assistant in the research project that she was working on with Geneviève Brisson, who was also working at SFU at the time, and now she's at Université de Sherbrooke. And during that time when I started my PhD, which was around 2017, 2018, a book that Natalie, Diane, Suzanne Smythe, I'm going to try not to forget anyone, Cher Hill, Margaret MacDonald, and Kéline had written together called Disrupting Boundaries had just been published as well. And as kind of a companion to that book, this wonderful team of women researchers also put together a seminar in the spring of 2018 that happened to be my directed readings course, and I felt very fortunate to do that. And around that time, in 2018, is when I feel the sociomaterial theories that appeared on the slide last and Indigenous perspectives started kind of like entering into a conversation. In the beginning, I remember that it was during that seminar that I just mentioned, the materiality seminar, out of the 20 or so readings that were on that list, one of them was Zoe Todd's piece. I don't know if some of you know this one. It's called An Indigenous Feminist Take on the Ontological Turn. Ontology is just another word for colonialism. That was on the reading list, and that was really eye-opening for me and caught my attention in terms of just briefly in that paper what Zoe Todd does is she talks about being at a conference where she was listening to Bruno Latour talk about actor network theory and about sociomaterial theories, and she was waiting for him to name Indigenous thinkers because Latour was talking about a cosmological view of the world. And so to her, it really echoed the knowledges, the things that she knew, that she had learned from the Indigenous thinkers in her own community. And it's a really great paper. And if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to. But in it, she really kind of makes a case for and remembers vividly just waiting for him to name one Inuit thinker, one Indigenous thinker on that matter of a cosmological view of the world, of a relational view of the world, and it never came. And so that quote that's on this slide is from that paper. She writes that when we cite European thinkers who discuss the more than human but do not discuss their Indigenous contemporaries who are writing on the exact same topics, we perpetuate the white supremacy of the academy. So at the same time as I was diving into my own kind of inquiry, my own sort of questioning and wonderings in this project that I was involved with Diane and Geneviève that had to do with multimodal literacy and with language education. And we were so interested in Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy and new materialism and post-humanism. I had this really the honor, the privilege to read the work of Zoe Todd, and Eve Tuck, I think, was on that reading list as well. And then at the same time, I remember the Vancouver Writers Fest that fall also happened to have journalist Tanya Talaga as a guest curator, and she just like brought forward all these Indigenous voices to the table, and it just was a time when it became very very compelling to also open to Indigenous perspectives and to realize that the relational view that was being brought forward by through sociomaterial theories had been brought forward for a very long time by Indigenous perspectives before that.
Just say a little bit more about, you talked about the multi-language sort of approach that you were working at with Diane. Could you say just a little bit more about what that project was, maybe something about ScribJab and what you were...
The context, yes, the context of the research project that my doctoral inquiry ended up being nested in had to do with ScribJab, which was a tool. I'm talking about it in the past because unfortunately we had to close down the website and the application, but we're hoping that it can revive one day. So it's a tool that used to be a website and an application that allowed users to write a story, thank you, Ron, to write a story in different languages. So the idea with it was that you could write a story in English or French and also in another language. And it had, like, at the time it closed, I think it had more than 80 different languages, some of them European languages, some of them Indigenous languages, like lots of different ones that also ended up being added as more and more users used the platform and suggested that we add those languages. And really the research project in itself, the more like global one, was about exploring how ScribJab was taken up in different ecologies. So in homes where there were several languages, we went in and children ended up writing stories sometimes with their grandmas or their mother or other people. And then also in schools, we went into two different school settings, one French immersion classroom and another English one, where the teachers, we would work with them collaboratively, and they would design kind of like a mini project that their students could do in the classroom, which would involve writing a story with ScribJab. And then the third ecology was a library, a community library that we went in, and we facilitated some workshops over the summer holidays to which children and their parents or teenagers on their own were invited to also create plurilingual stories. And within that more kind of global context, what I ended up doing was focusing on the question of identity, because it had been a focus of my master's as well. So I kind of started wondering how having a sociomaterial approach to a sociomaterial kind of like framework to exploring the questions of identity in plurilingual for French minority settings was maybe casting a different light on that question that I had been sort of examining and wondering about in a more, like I said earlier, sociocultural or post-structural way before that. And then the Indigenous perspectives even opened up more about this.
Yeah, so just talking about that, I think because this is we're interested in the question of method and how it relates to theory, and especially for people here who are still working on their PhDs and trying to think through that process. So Magali, your question around identity and using ScribJab and so on, those were all questions that were arising from the first theories that you talked about. Mm-hmm. And so one question I have, and it's not just idle speculation, because I want to invite you to think about how our theories are related to our research questions, which is, if you had known about Indigenous perspectives earlier on, maybe even in your master's degree, how do you think that would have changed the research that you ended up doing? And you know, it could be like everything from completely changed or not at all. But I think it's a question that a lot of us ask ourselves, because we've grown up in a certain way of doing research. There's certain research questions that are out there that have typically been posed within a paradigm, a Western paradigm. And when we ask ourselves, okay, how do we build in some of these Indigenous knowledges that really are affecting us so much and that we think are so important, how do we do that within this community that we are in, this scholarly community that we are in as settlers too?
Right.
And I'm listening to you, I'm just trying to get back online myself.
Yeah. I love the words speculation, because speculative dynamics are at the heart of all these sociomaterial theories that I was talking about earlier, and rhizomatic kind of ways of thinking. That's what I think Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy asks of us. Deleuze and Guattari were famous for asking that we really dive in concept creation and in like kind of really sort of thinking outside the box that we've been put in, for lack of a better word. But it's really about having, in the end, it's okay to have more questions than answers. And this is an approach that I really like. And when I read that question that you thought about, Natalie, I thought, but Indigenous perspectives have changed a lot to my research inquiry as it is already. And it's a really good question. Like, had I encountered them earlier, had I become interested in them earlier, would they have changed more, or probably in different ways? The one thing that I could think about was, and I think that's something that you've asked me about before, but it's this attachment that I have to the concept of identity. And ever since my master's, it's been something that I'm really interested in, especially as a teacher, as a practitioner. I think that, like in working with children and with teenagers, and then as of more recently with teachers as well, it's something that I've always been really interested in. And in the context that we're in a French minority context, I've been working as a French teacher and as a French immersion teacher for 13 years. I've always kind of like wondered, when I'm teaching French, which is for the most part for the students that I've encountered an additional language, how does that affect their identities? How does French become a part of their identities or not? How does it affect, does it influence their literacy practices? Do they, like, to go back to script job, when they're writing a story, when they're, but you could apply that to anything else, when they're listening to something, when they're reading something, do they, like, I've always been so intrigued in knowing if they, and it applies obviously to me and to you as well as plurilingual speakers, but do these kids think about an idea that they want to write about first in English, if that's their dominant language, or in another language that they might have in their family, and then translate it in French? Or do different ideas come to them in French than the ones they would have in their dominant language, in their mother tongue? That's something that I've always been interested in, and it continued into my PhD. And I remember as I dove into sociomaterial theories, you, Natalie, and then I don't know if you remember Elizabeth de Freitas, when she came to the New Materiality seminar, I remember both of you asking, well, maybe that's a concept that we're done talking about, that maybe we need a new concept. Like, because I just kept thinking, how can I talk about identity and how can I study identity in a non-anthropocentric way, which is a weird thing to say. because an identity, usually you perceive it in a mainstream way as something that pertains to you, that belongs to you. It's yours as a human, right? And so there was something that was kind of troubling to try and think with sociomaterial concepts, acknowledging that, for example, like the material world could be part of your identity. Like that was something, as someone who comes from a Eurocentric background, who grew up speaking French and English and Spanish, which are very anthropocentric, Eurocentric languages, that was something that was very troubling in a good way. So I was thinking, if I'd encountered Indigenous perspectives earlier, maybe that would have helped me kind of like not get rid of that concept, but just kind of like, oh, thank you. Okay. Think about it differently. Dr. Kim Tallbear, who works at the University of Alberta, she's Indigenous, she's a Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate citizen. She talks about identity, saying that it's something that it's a concept she doesn't like. She wrote this chapter that's called Identity is a Poor Substitute for Relating. And she talks about the fact that relationships that are inherent to any Indigenous community that are recognized as being central and as being the thing that's important, not the individual, but the relations that really unite all of the members of a community, is a better guiding narrative, in her own words. And that it's taken a while, but that Eurocentric, European and North American people who are not Indigenous, it's taken us long enough to get to this idea that relations are important and to really like put them at the center. So it's something that I've learned a lot from. Sean Wilson talks about it a lot in Research as Ceremony, relationality, how it's really a lens, a different way of viewing the world and of living in the world than the more individualistic one that is central in North America. Jennifer Grants, who's at UBC, also does a beautiful job of I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but I highly recommend just reading even like the beginning of her thesis, where she opens with this idea of really trying to take on this different lens, of imagining putting on different glasses that make us see the world through a web of connections and through relationality. So I think maybe that would have pushed me even more towards relationality from the beginning of the project if I had encountered these perspectives earlier, to answer your question.
That's really nice. I think I also, in case anybody here is doing research on identity, I don't think that Magali is saying that that's wrong.
No.
And that there is the reason why identity is so important to us comes from our own history of post-Enlightenment thinking. So it does solve some problems that we have. And so it's not like you throw it out because we find a better concept, but I think you're sort of showing us how we can learn about, in this case, two different concepts, and that part of the work is also trying to relate them and understand where do they come from and what problems do they help us solve, given who we are right now. Because we can't go back to pre-Enlightenment era, right?
No.
And you can't go back to your thesis.
No.
Okay, I thought we could talk a little bit. So we talked about your PhD thesis, and there is life after finishing your PhD. And Magali has continued to do some research and has been involved in a project, I know also with Diane and Geneviève, where they're using some post-qualitative research. So if that's a new term for you, don't worry. We're not going to define it here. Just try to ride the wave and get as much as you can. But if you're interested in finding out more, feel free to contact Magali. So post-qualitative research. So I thought so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about, more or less why the shift from qualitative to post-qualitative. What were the ideas that that were important to you in that shift. And maybe I think you even have some interesting connections that you've made around post-qualitative research and some of the Indigenous methodologies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, thank you. So I want to start by saying that that word post-qualitative and the whole kind of current that came out of it, much of it was influenced by the work of Elizabeth St. Pierre in the United States, and her perspective on post-qualitative inquiry, and when she offered that up, was that we start a research project by reading. We don't have predetermined, or we don't start by determining our research questions and our research plan and how we're going to collect data or generate data and then do analysis and then think about the discussion and the implications. We start with reading, and then the reading is going to help us as we kind of are on the field at the same, and we keep reading. And as we get on the field at the same time, like, reading is going to be with us all the way through, and that's what's going to help us kind of generate questions and change our questions, and it's a messy kind of process. And that was the appeal for me in the project that you mentioned, that I mentioned with Diane and with Geneviève. We didn't start by reading. We started with their short grant proposal that was accepted. And that short grant proposal, as you know, is very linear and it's very compartmentalized, and it's got research questions and objectives and all of that. And so Elizabeth St. Pierre would probably say that that's not post-qualitative inquiry. But as the project evolved and as we moved forward, we started reading more of Elizabeth St. Pierre's work, and then some of the work of Alicia Jackson and Lisa Mazai, who both worked with Elizabeth St. Pierre and who kind of like kept going with the post-qualitative inquiry. And the part that we liked was really that idea that reading is with us all the way through in a research project, and that the research project, and that's what appealed, that's what I found appealing from my master's research project. And I think that, I hope that some of you will relate to that, but I've always wondered ever since the beginning of my master's why it seemed like my way of engaging in a research project was so messy, and that I was all over the place, and that I kept wanting to read more of this or to go back on that reading when I was in the middle of talking with my students, because I was doing an action project, an action research project in my own classroom. And should I be going back to the literature when I've already written my literature review? Anyways, I felt like I was all over the place, and that in articles that I was reading, scientific articles, or in conferences when I would listen to someone do a presentation, things seemed very linear and clear and very kind of straightforward. And then I read Elizabeth St. Pierre's work, who says that that's not how it works, and that it is constraining, and that it is not working for her to put things in little boxes and to make them appear as linear. So that was the appeal for me, and I think it has to do with disrupting, with troubling, and with unsettling, and that's where I find the connection with the conversation with Indigenous perspectives, because I think that there's, again, this idea in mainstream qualitative research from the perspective that Diane, Geneviève, and I had, and Gwenaëlle André was also part of that research project, that we were participating in perpetuating this linear view of research that's very clean and that fits, again, in little boxes. And at some point we were just like, no, it's not working for us. And I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that I think that it's good that there are different ways to conduct research as well. And so reading the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who talks about research as this dirty word, a word that she really feels has been imposed together with the processes that go with it on her own people, and that it has not been good for for herself and for Indigenous peoples in New Zealand. And I think that that's something that can be said about research here as well. I wanted to know more about that, and I wanted to try and connect both. So I think it's about troubling and disrupting what research is, or what counts as research, and also what the role of the researcher is. And I'll just make one last link with something that I've learned from Indigenous perspectives by attending a workshop that was facilitated by John Chenoweth and Diane Bin, who both participated in the writing of one of the Pulling Together guides. I don't know if you've heard about those, but they've been published online by BC Campus, and they're a fantastic resource about decolonizing and indigenizing research. I remember the first workshop that they facilitated based on these guides. They read from the opening of the guide and taught us the meaning of the word Hilkala it's in Kwakwala, in the Kwakwala language, and Hilkala means, it's the word that's used for a researcher, and it means, and I'm quoting them, one who is allowed or has permission. The term reflects a researcher's responsibility and ongoing role in Indigenous research. While it takes a person a lifetime to develop into this role, it is not done alone. There are helpers, guides, and teachers along the way. So in that sense, it was really, for me, I'm not saying that Indigenous research and post-qualitative inquiry are the same thing, but I just saw a similar kind of opportunity to disrupt, to trouble productively the ways in which research are done, so that it can be opened up to different ways of doing research, doing inquiry.
So that's nicely connected to the quote that you showed me that Carolyn Roberts gave at the end of the last year's PDP, was it?
That's actually part of, she's got a wonderful blog, if you haven't looked at it yet, and she writes quite frequently on it. And that was one post that was about, it was titled, "Can You Decolonize Assessment?" And so she was talking, she's addressing teachers in it, and she's talking about decolonizing assessment. What does this entail? And she's saying, I'm not going to give you a nice little checklist of how you can build an assessment. I'm not going to give you templates of what your assessments could look like, but I'm going to give you questions that you can ask yourself and your colleagues and talk about it in an ongoing way. And so the two questions that I chose to put on that slide that she asks, that I thought resonated with things that I want to do and that I've been interested in doing, are the following. First of all, what did I do today that was decolonizing my classroom practice? And you could apply it to your research practice too. And the other one is, in what ways did I disrupt the colonial narrative today rather than perpetuate it? Which I think are really great questions.
So tying back to methodology, you mentioned, we have a certain vision of what method should look like that's very temporal and separate in many different ways. That come alongside ideas of validity and of things like rigor. And I think a lot of people, students and faculty members alike, can get really worried sometimes about, is this like the proper way of doing research? And we'll hear often from people who are doubting of like, oh, well, that's not rigorous. Like, that'll never pass, So how have you been thinking about that idea of rigor? Because I know it's come up for you as well. And what would you say to people who are sort of trying to think about by what standards are they being held accountable in this idea of rigor, and what are the opportunities to push back?
Well, I was very fortunate to be working with people who allowed me and encouraged me to push back. So in my dissertation and my work with Diane and with Geneviève, who I was mentioning before, one of the things that they, again, encouraged me and allowed me to do, I mean, when you're talking about standards, you have to pass your comprehensive exams, you have to write your dissertation, and for it to be accepted by your committee before you go on to defend it. So I don't know that every supervisor would have allowed me to go that way, but the questioning of central pillars of mainstream qualitative research was definitely central in my work, in my dissertation. And so these are some of the words, and rigor is one of them, that appear under sourature as I saw that first in the work of Marge Sellers, who works in New Zealand, this way of presenting concepts that are that she thinks with in her research, sourature, and then learned that it actually came from Derrida, and actually it comes from Heidegger, I think, originally. So anyways, it's a long genealogy, but I like this idea that by still having them present in my own reflection, in my own work, the concepts of research, of conceptual framework, of methodology, of data analysis, of rigor, there are other ones too, but presenting them sourature, so under erasure, it signals that there's something that's being questioned, that's something in that concept, in that pillar, like I said earlier, is being questioned and doesn't quite work for me, for the person who's writing it like that, but it also signals that I'm asking myself questions about it. I don't necessarily have a replacement word for it. In some cases I do, but I'm more interested in the kind of like work that it has allowed me to do to question these words. So for example, the word rigor, it's a word that's come often in, especially in conferences when we've done, it's not just me when I do it, it's also when Diane has presented with me, and she's very well known and respected in the literacy education stage, but it's happened that we do a presentation where we explain that we think with theory, we don't use theory, we don't mobilize concepts, we think with it, and that we also share some glowing data, and I can go back on that afterwards, data that glowed for us. We didn't use in vivo, we didn't code our data, we chose a data that chose us to, that people in the end in the questions ask, well, how rigorous is this? And how is that, like are you able to write articles and like be published with this and like research? And I think it's interesting the tension that it creates, because it goes back to this idea that research has to look a certain way and it has to fit into neatly, like well-defined containers that are separate from another, and it has to follow the, again, like literature review, methodology, research design before that, data collection, data analysis, implications, discussion, when really, does it need to always look like that? And I'm more interested in engaging in this discussion than in trying to justify how rigorous my approach was, because it's a word that I don't really like anyways. I think it's Celeste in the Faculty of Education that also says that it reminds her of rigor mortis, of the expression rigor mortis. And I don't know if any of you wants to associate their research with this, but I think that inquiry should create joy, and it should create opportunities for us to really engage in interesting conversations. And so I agree with Celeste on that one, that that's not necessarily a word that I want to associate to.
We love that word in math. We're
yes.
very crazy about it.
Rigor.
I want to jump to another question and then open the floor up for some more conversation. But given the topic of this, I feel like we really need to get to this question. And
okay. Looking
around at who's here, I think it's a pertinent question for many of you, which is the issue of language. So you work in French education, and French is a minority language here in BC, of course. but it is also protected by federal law as one of the 2 official languages of Canada, and therefore relatively well funded. There are schools that you can go to and your kids can be taught in French here in BC in the same way that they can be taught in English. At the same time, we are facing the loss, not only in BC but worldwide, but especially important to us in BC, of dozens of Indigenous languages that we will never recuperate. Or maybe we will, I don't know, it doesn't look so good. So my question is, what do you think, why do you think it's important to keep working in research in French education, and how do you sort of manage some of the tensions that relate to the status of French here in BC in relation to the status of Indigenous languages?
It's I agree with that word you used. It's a tension, like it creates tension to be both a speaker and a researcher and a teacher in French. I speak French. I grew up speaking French, Spanish, and English later on in my life, and those are 3 of the languages that are associated with some pretty big colonizing countries in the world. And then I end up being now in British Columbia, where there's this wealth of Indigenous languages and Indigenous cultures. If I can find the slide, yes. According to Stats Canada, there's 34 languages, 61 dialects, and 7 language families in BC only, which represents more than 60% of all Indigenous languages spoken in Canada. So compared to the slide before, where, I don't know how useful it is to compare, but I just want to be conscious of this. Like in 2021, 1.5% of the population in BC spoke French regularly at home, and 1% of workers living in BC used French regularly at work. It's a pretty small number, right? Living in that tension reminds me of the importance of, and that's something that Vicky, you taught me, of honoring what it is that I've learned and the languages and the cultures that I come from, and being conscious of the duty that it comes with. And so doing research in a French minority setting, but also in Canada, where French is an official language, it comes with the responsibility, with the duty. Remember the significance of the word for researcher in Kwakwala, Helkala, that it comes with responsibilities, it comes with duties, it comes with this responsibility of having these conversations. And in French, it's quite contentious to talk about the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives often, and this is a diagram that we can look at a little bit more, if you're interested in it, but often I work with, like I said, with teachers and with students, and often from teachers, and I'm sure that it's applicable to researchers as well. There's either, when it comes to the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and the work of really engaging in reconciliation meaningfully, there's people who find themselves caught between deliberate abstention, so not doing anything, or feeling paralyzed, which is also not doing anything, for the reasons that are put around there. I did this comes directly with the work that I did with teachers last year as I worked as a faculty associate in some of the graduate diploma of education in French. So people would say either, well, this is not relevant because I do not have any Indigenous students, so why would I include Indigenous perspectives? I do not know anyone who is Indigenous, so how can I do this in a respectful way? I do not have enough time. I'm not going to read all of them. But some of them, you might recognize either things that you've heard said or things that you've thought too. I've thought before, I don't know where to start, or I'm scared I'll make a mistake, or people are going to think I'm appropriating ideas or perspectives, so how do I do this in a respectful way. And it's work. It takes, like an investment, a personal investment in reading and building connections and thinking and making mistakes sometimes. I really love the work of Joe Corona, who wrote the book Why and who also participated in the steering committee that put together the principles of learning, the BC principles of learning. How does it go in English? The BC principles of First Peoples principles of learning. And we'll be okay. We'll, get up and apologize if we've done something wrong, if we said something wrong, and learn from it, and then move forward. But if we don't, if we never do anything, if we abstain from doing anything, or if we just stay in this state of feeling paralyzed, then reconciliation is not going to happen. And so in French, because again it's contentious to talk about the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives for diverse reasons. Sometimes here in BC, it's the idea that there's very little resources in French about Indigenous perspectives, or that we're going to put a burden on an Indigenous person who's already very busy. We have one in the Francophone School Board, in which I'm working in right now as a teacher in one of the schools. We have one person working as the Indigenous Education Director, and she's got another person working with her, but she is supposed to be the resource person for all of the schools across BC. So it's a legitimate thing to think, but if we don't engage in that work and I'm talking as a non-Indigenous person, if I don't engage in that work, and if I don't have conversations in French with other people, even if they're difficult sometimes to have, then we're not going to develop a common vocabulary to make things move forward. Mm-hmm. And then, but reconciliation is not going to happen. So I think that that's why I continue to do that work in French, being conscious of, in some ways, the privilege that I have, but also the honor and the responsibility and the duty to continue to do that.
Thank you. It reminds me of, I've been reading this book by Senegalese French-American author Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who's very interested in the idea of translation as a way of trying to find ways in which we can communicate, find unity without stamping out difference, but without making difference the only thing that sort of is at play, and emphasizing those differences. And he writes, certain languages dominate others, and yet when a translator gets to work, they welcome a creation within their own language. It is at that moment that the relationship of violence that can exist between language is erased and replaced by a humanist gesture, a profoundly human move. It is an ethical gesture, that of hospitality, and of constructing a bridge between two visions of the world, between two people speaking different languages. Sounds like a little bit what you were doing when you were talking about the word for researcher, this creating a bridge, and what you were saying about the importance of having ways of talking to each other.
Thanks for sharing that. I really like that quote, and it reminds me of, the necessary conversation that needs to happen, and of the different kind of meaning that translation has in this way, because again, like being a speaker of European languages, of French, English, and Spanish, in their modern version too, which is different from what they used to be. And there's Indigenous languages that exist also in France and in for English, like different varieties too of English that still exist, and same for Spanish. But it just makes me think of how these languages in their modern version are disconnected from, I think I touched a little bit upon it earlier, but from the land, and from there's not an inherent relational view of them that's built in them, as my little understanding of some Indigenous words is. Like, I feel like whenever people like John Chenoweth or Diane Bin, or I had the good fortune to work with Ramona Elk too last year, who's one of Vicky's students, and she's really generous with that too. But when people share what a word means more than the equivalent translation of it in English, it opens up really a worldview and a perspective that I don't think I can have access to in French and English or in Spanish if I'm not explaining what it is exactly. So I was thinking of another word like that, and it wasn't a word, sorry about that. It was just one last quote that I wanted to share. And this goes back to Cindy honoring also the Halkmelem and Squamish languages that, you know, like are present on these lands, and the part of the talk that's about conducting work in French and in English too. Is that taking up space that Indigenous languages and cultures could have? Yes, it is in a way, but if we do it in a good way, if we do that work, you know, like really centering around reconciliation and around giving space and funds for Indigenous languages and cultures, I think that that conversation can be quite important and productive, because we don't want these languages to disappear. And I just wanted to bring up that quote of Richard Bagamies, who writes that when your language disappears, so does your ability to read the world in a traditional manner. And that goes back to me to what you were, the passage that you were reading from Suleiman's book about translation. It's not just about giving equivalence, it's really about honoring the fact that a language, and I find that Indigenous languages do that beautifully, is also a way to greet the world in a traditional manner. So remembering this is important, I think. Sorry.
No problem.
That's the last thing I wanted to.
Beautiful way to
bring up.
end, as if it was planned, to come back to the beginning.
As if.